The baby had stopped crying. In the middle of a freezing Chicago snowstorm, in a wicker basket outside a luxury tower, a tiny girl lay silent, her skin turning cold, her breath fading. 5 more minutes, the doctor would later say, and she wouldn't have survived. But what no one knew that night was that the poor janitor who found her was about to change the life of one of the richest and most feared men in the city. And before this story ends, that same baby would call her Mama. If stories about love, sacrifice, and second chances touch your heart, please consider subscribing. Now let me tell you what really happened that winter night. Belle Hawkins was 27 years old, and most people who worked in Thornton Tower didn't even know she existed. Every night, while Chicago's wealthy executives went home to warm houses and soft beds, Belle stayed behind on the 18th floor with a mop, a bucket, and 12 hours of work ahead of her. Her hands were always red and cracked from chemicals. Her shoes were worn thin at the soles. And her paycheck barely covered the rent for her tiny 12-square-meter room on the south side. 6 days a week. No holidays. No insurance. No one asking if she was tired. By morning, the offices shined like glass. Oak desks polished. Carpets spotless. Coffee stains erased. Trash gone. By evening, the rich returned, in tailored suits and polished shoes, talking about deals worth more money than Belle would see in 10 years. They left half-eaten lunches on their desks. And not once, in 3.5 years, did anyone look her in the eye. To them, she was invisible. But Belle didn't complain. Life had already taught her something simple and hard. When you're poor, the world doesn't see you. That night, the storm came early. By 11:30 p.m., the wind howled against Thornton Tower like an animal trying to break inside. Snow blew sideways across the empty streets, and the temperature dropped low enough to freeze skin in minutes. Belle finished lining up the cleaning supplies in the maintenance room and peeled off her old yellow gloves. The hot water had been broken for 2 months, so she washed her hands in cold water, biting her lip as the cracks in her skin stung. She took her thin coat from the locker, the only one in the entire building with her name on it, and wrapped her mother's old wool scarf around her neck. The elevator ride down felt longer than usual. She leaned her head against the cold metal wall and closed her eyes. In a few hours, her alarm would ring again. Instant coffee. A piece of bread. 2 buses across the city. Another house to clean before coming back here again at night. Day after day. Week after week. The elevator opened into the grand lobby. Marble floors. Leather sofas. Walnut reception desk. Everything quiet, elegant, expensive, and completely empty. Belle walked toward the glass doors. Outside, the storm looked dangerous. White wind swallowing the street, no cars, no people, no movement at all. She reached for the handle. And then she heard it. A sound so small it almost disappeared into the wind. Belle froze. She waited. Nothing. Just the storm. She shook her head. 12 hours of work could play tricks on your ears. She took another step toward the door. Then she heard it again. A cry. Weak. Thin. The sound of a baby. Belle's bag slipped from her shoulder and hit the marble floor. The crying was coming from outside. She pushed the heavy glass doors open, and the storm slammed into her like a wall. Snow hit her face. The wind cut straight through her coat. But the crying was louder now. To the right of the entrance, near the granite columns, she saw it. A wicker basket. A pink blanket, soaked with snow. And it was moving. Belle dropped to her knees, her hands shaking as she pulled the blanket back. Inside was a baby girl, maybe 8 or 9 months old, her tiny face red from crying, her body trembling, her skin cold to the touch. "Dear God," Belle whispered. She didn't think. She didn't hesitate. She took off her coat, the only warm thing she owned, wrapped it around the baby, and held her tight against her chest. The wind bit into her shoulders instantly. But she ran back inside. In the empty lobby, her voice echoed as she shouted for help. No answer. She carried the baby into the restroom, turned on warm water, and gently wiped the snow from her face. The crying grew weaker. Then weaker. Then suddenly, it stopped. That silence terrified Belle more than any scream. She pressed her ear to the baby's chest. The heartbeat was there. But the breathing, uneven, shallow, fading. Her hands shook as she reached for her old phone to call 911. That was when she heard the elevator. The doors opened. And the man who stepped out was not security. He was tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in a perfect black suit even at midnight. His face was sharp, controlled, the face of someone used to power. But his eyes were red. Desperate. He was on the phone, his voice shaking. "I don't care what it costs," he said. "Search every street, every hotel, every station." His voice broke. "That's my daughter. My little Rosalie." Belle's heart stopped. The man looked up. His eyes fell on the bundle in her arms. The baby let out a weak, trembling sound. The phone slipped from his hand and shattered on the marble floor. And in the next second, the most powerful man in Thornton Tower ran toward a poor janitor and dropped to his knees in front of her. Before we continue, tell me in the comments, what would you have done if you were Belle that night? Because what happens next will pull her into a world she never imagined, and a choice that could change her life forever. Part 2 continues from the moment he sees his daughter in her arms. The man didn't speak at first. He stayed on his knees, his hands hovering in the air as if he was afraid to touch the baby, afraid she might disappear if he moved too fast. "Rosalie," his voice broke on the name. Belle slowly opened the coat so he could see her face. The baby's eyes were closed, her lips pale, her breathing uneven. One tiny hand was still gripping the edge of Belle's uniform like she didn't want to let go. The man's shoulders began to shake. For a long moment, he just stared at his daughter. Then he bent forward, his forehead almost touching the small bundle, and the sound that came out of him didn't belong to a powerful man. It was the sound of a father who had already imagined losing his child. Belle had never seen anything like it. She had heard the name before. Everyone who worked in Thornton Tower knew it. Silas Thornton, owner of the building. Owner of Thornton Industries, one of the richest men in Chicago. And the whispers said there was more beneath the surface. Deals made behind closed doors. Power that didn't come from boardrooms alone. But right now, none of that mattered. Right now, he was just a father, crying on the marble floor. Belle forced her voice steady. "She needs a hospital," she said softly. "Right now." Silas lifted his head. His eyes were wet, but something sharp came back into them, like a man waking up from a nightmare. He stood immediately, pulling his phone from the floor, ignoring the cracked screen. "Patrick," he said. His voice was cold now, controlled. "Front entrance. 30 seconds. Northwestern. Call Dr. Sullivan. Infant emergency." He ended the call and looked at Belle. "You're coming with me." It wasn't a request. Belle opened her mouth to protest. She needed to get home. She had work in a few hours. She was just a janitor. This wasn't her world. Then the baby gave a weak, fragile sound against her chest. And Belle nodded. The storm hit them again when the doors opened, but this time a black SUV was already waiting, headlights cutting through the snow. The driver jumped out and opened the rear door before they even reached the steps. Inside, warmth wrapped around them instantly. Soft cream leather seats. Heated air. A quiet engine that barely made a sound. Belle sat stiffly, soaked uniform against expensive upholstery, holding a baby wrapped in her worn coat. Silas sat beside her, his hand resting lightly over Rosalie's leg, like he needed to feel she was still there. For a while, neither of them spoke. The city rushed past outside, blurred by snow and streetlights. Finally, his voice came, low and rough. "What's your name?" "Belle. Belle Hawkins." He nodded once. "Thank you for finding her." There was so much weight in those words that Belle didn't know how to answer. She looked down at the baby instead. "She was outside," Belle said quietly. "In a basket. There was a note." Silas turned toward her. "What did it say?" Belle swallowed. "It said, 'I can't do this anymore. Please forgive me.'" Silence filled the car. The muscles in his jaw tightened, but he didn't say anything. He just closed his eyes for a moment, his hand still resting protectively on his daughter. The SUV turned sharply and pulled into a private emergency entrance. What Belle saw next stunned her. A full medical team was already waiting outside in the snow. Heated blankets. A small infant gurney. Equipment ready. One phone call. That was the kind of power Silas Thornton had. The doors opened, and Belle carefully handed Rosalie over. The moment the baby left her arms, an unexpected emptiness spread through her chest. The doctors moved quickly, speaking in calm, professional voices. Low body temperature. Possible dehydration. Respiration weak but present. They disappeared through double doors. And just like that, the warmth that had filled Belle's arms was gone. Silas stood there, staring at the doors like he could force them open with his eyes. His hands were clenched at his sides. His back straight. But Belle could see it. He was terrified. They sat in the waiting area. Minutes stretched. Then 30 minutes. Then 40. Neither of them spoke. Finally, the doors opened. A gray-haired doctor walked toward them. "She's stable," he said. The change in Silas was immediate. His shoulders dropped, like someone had cut the strings holding him tight. "Her temperature is coming back to normal," the doctor continued. "She's dehydrated and hasn't been properly cared for over the last few days. But she's strong. You brought her in just in time." Then he looked at Belle. "You saved her life." Belle blinked. I just found her." The doctor shook his head. 5 or 10 more minutes outside in that weather, and this would be a very different conversation. Belle's throat tightened. She didn't want to imagine that. They were allowed to see Rosalie later in a private recovery room. The baby lay in a heated bassinet, her cheeks pink again, her breathing slow and steady. Silas stood beside her for a long time. Then he bent down and pressed his lips to her forehead. "I'm here," he whispered. "I'm here. I promise. Never again." Belle turned toward the window to give him privacy. The storm was still raging outside, but inside the room everything felt quiet. Safe. She was about to step back when his voice came from behind her. "I owe you my daughter's life." Belle turned. Silas was looking at her differently now. Not like a stranger. Not like an employee. Like he was really seeing her. "I just wanted her to be okay," Belle said softly. "That's enough for me." He studied her for a long moment. Then he reached into his coat and pulled out a thick ivory card. "This is my private number," he said. "If you ever need anything, call." Belle took the card slowly. It felt heavier than paper should. An hour later, the same black SUV dropped her off on the south side. The contrast hit her immediately. Peeling brick. Rusted railings. Trash bins along the alley. Snow covering everything but not hiding the decay underneath. Her world. She unlocked the door to her tiny room and stepped inside. Cold air leaked through the window. The ceiling stain spread across the corner like always. She kicked off her shoes and sat on the edge of the bed. Only then did she realize something. Her coat. She had left it wrapped around the baby. Belle lay back and stared at the ceiling. In 4 hours, her alarm would ring. Another day. Another bus. Another house to clean. But her fingers moved slowly to her pocket. She pulled out the ivory card. Silas Thornton. 3 phone numbers in gold lettering. Belle stared at it for a long time. Then she whispered quietly into the empty room. "What kind of world did I just step into?" And somewhere across the city, in a private hospital room, a rich man was looking at his daughter, and thinking about the poor woman who had run into a storm for her. The alarm rang before the sky had even turned gray. Belle opened her eyes, and for a few seconds she didn't move. Her body ached the way it always did after a long shift, but her mind was still somewhere else. Somewhere warm. Somewhere quiet. Somewhere with a tiny hand gripping her uniform. Then the cold air slipping through the window brought her back. Her room was the same. The stain on the ceiling. The cracked paint. The sound of pipes knocking in the walls. Nothing had changed, except the ivory card still resting in her hand. She must have fallen asleep holding it. Belle sat up slowly, rubbed her face, and placed the card on the small table beside her bed. "Get it together," she whispered to herself. Life didn't change overnight. Not for people like her. By 5:30, she was dressed and out the door. The morning air was sharp, the kind that cut through layers of clothing. She wrapped her mother's old scarf tighter around her shoulders and started the 4-block walk to the bus stop. That's when she felt it. The cold hitting straight through her coat. She stopped walking. Her coat. She didn't have one anymore. For a moment, she almost turned back. But there was no time, and missing the bus meant losing half a day's pay. So she kept walking, arms folded tight, shoulders hunched against the wind. By the time she reached the house in Lincoln Park, her fingers were stiff and numb. The lawyer barely looked up when Belle came in. "You're late by 3 minutes," the woman said sharply from the kitchen table. "Try to be more professional." "Yes, ma'am," Belle answered quietly. She went straight to work, mopping floors, scrubbing sinks, making beds. Her hands moved automatically, but her mind kept drifting. Back to the hospital room. Back to the sound of that man's voice when he said, "I owe you my daughter's life." Around noon, while she was wiping the living room windows, her phone vibrated in her pocket. Unknown number. Belle hesitated. Then she answered. "Hello, Belle, this is Silas Thornton." His voice sounded different in daylight. Controlled. But there was something underneath it. Something tight. Belle straightened without realizing it. "Yes. Is she okay?" There was a brief pause. "She's stable," he said. "Final checkup this morning. They're discharging her this afternoon." Belle let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding since the night before. "I'm glad," she said softly. "I need to ask you something." Her hand tightened around the phone. "I need someone to care for Rosalie," he continued. "Someone I trust." Belle blinked, not sure she'd heard him right. "I don't trust strangers," he went on. "And I don't trust agencies. But you didn't hesitate. You didn't know who I was. You didn't ask for anything. You just protected her." Silence stretched between them. Then he said it. $8,000 a month. Full insurance. You'll live in my home. Private room. Your only responsibility is Rosalie. The words hit Belle like a sudden drop in an elevator. 8,000. That was more than she made in 3 months. It was more than she had ever imagined earning. She looked around the living room she was cleaning. The expensive furniture. The woman upstairs who had called her by the wrong name for 3 months. And for the first time, Belle didn't feel invisible. Think about it, Silas said quietly. But I need someone I can trust. And right now, you're the only person I do. The call ended. Belle stood there, the cleaning cloth still in her hand. Her heart was beating fast. Too fast. Belle, the lawyer's voice snapped from upstairs. If you're on your phone again, you can go home and not come back. Yes, ma'am, Belle said quickly, putting the phone away. She went back to wiping the glass. But now she could see her own reflection, and she didn't recognize the woman looking back. That afternoon, instead of going home, Belle walked straight to Dorothy's kitchen. The old woman was already there, making tea like she always did. She took one look at Belle's face and didn't ask questions. She just set a cup in front of her. Talk, Dorothy said gently. Belle told her everything. The storm. The baby. The hospital. The offer. When she finished, Dorothy was quiet for a long moment. Then she reached across the table and took Belle's hand. You took care of your mama for 2 years, she said softly. Fed her. Bathed her. Stayed up nights when she was in pain. Belle swallowed. That baby doesn't need a certificate, Dorothy continued. She needs a heart. And you've got more heart than anyone I know. Belle stared down at the tea. I don't belong in that world, she whispered. Dorothy smiled a little. Honey, money doesn't decide where you belong. Character does. Belle sat there for a long time. The kitchen clock ticked. The tea went cold. Finally, she reached into her pocket and pulled out the ivory card. Her hands were shaking when she dialed the number. It rang once. Then twice. Silas Thornton. Belle closed her eyes. I'll do it, she said. There was a quiet exhale on the other end. Patrick will pick you up tomorrow at 9, he replied. The line went dead. Just like that. Belle sat there, the phone still in her hand. Dorothy squeezed her shoulder. Well, she said softly, looks like your life just changed. That night, Belle went back to her tiny room and looked around slowly. The bed. The cracked window. The single lamp. She opened her closet. It took less than an hour to pack everything she owned. 2 suitcases. 27 years of life. She placed them by the door and turned off the light. But she didn't sleep. She lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the wind outside. Tomorrow morning, a black SUV would pull up to the curb. Tomorrow morning, she would leave the only life she had ever known. And as she closed her eyes, one thought kept repeating in her mind. What if I don't belong there? Outside, somewhere across the city, a rich man was standing in a quiet nursery, holding his daughter, and waiting for the poor woman who had become the only person he trusted to walk into his world. Belle woke before the alarm. For a moment, she forgot where she was. Then she saw the 2 suitcases by the door, and the reality settled back into her chest. Today. She sat on the edge of the bed and looked around the room slowly. The cracked window that never closed all the way. The stain on the ceiling she had stared at for 3 years. The narrow space that had been her whole world. It wasn't much. But it had been hers. Belle stood, folded the blanket neatly, and placed her mother's photo carefully inside her bag. She ran her fingers over the frame for a second longer than necessary. Wish me luck, she whispered. At exactly 9 o'clock, the black SUV turned onto her street. It looked out of place among the old brick buildings and rusted fences, like something from a different city entirely. Patrick stepped out, nodded politely, and took her suitcases without asking questions. Belle slid into the back seat. As the car pulled away, she watched the south side through the window. Small houses pressed close together. Empty lots. Faded storefronts. People bundled against the cold, waiting for buses. Her world. Then slowly, mile by mile, everything began to change. The streets grew cleaner. The houses grew larger. Trees lined the sidewalks. Cars became newer, shinier. Even the snow looked different somehow. Whiter. Untouched. By the time the SUV turned onto a quiet road shaded by old oak trees, Belle felt like she had crossed an invisible line. Ahead of them stood a tall black iron gate. Security cameras watched from stone pillars. A small glass security station sat to the side, glowing with screens. Patrick pressed a button. The gate opened silently. As they drove inside, Belle saw men in dark suits positioned along the driveway. Their posture straight. Their eyes alert. This wasn't just a home. This was a protected world. Then the house came into view. 3 stories of blue-gray stone. Tall windows. Wide steps leading to an arched entrance. Snow-covered gardens stretching out on both sides like something from a magazine. Belle had cleaned houses for rich people before. But this wasn't a house. This was another life. The front door opened. Silas Thornton stood at the top of the steps. He wasn't wearing a suit this time. Just a gray sweater and dark trousers. And in his arms was Rosalie. The baby was bundled in a soft yellow outfit, her cheeks pink, her eyes wide and curious. Silas walked down the steps slowly. And then he smiled. It wasn't the controlled smile of a businessman. It was warm. Real. "Belle," he said quietly. "Thank you for coming." Something inside her chest loosened. He stepped closer and held Rosalie toward her. The baby leaned forward immediately, tiny hands reaching. Belle hesitated only a second before taking her. The moment Rosalie settled into her arms, she relaxed, her small fingers grabbing Belle's collar like she already knew her. Belle felt the warmth of her little body and something deep inside her softened. "Hello, sweetheart," she whispered. Behind Silas, an older woman stepped forward. "This is Margaret," he said. "She's been running this house for 20 years. Margaret took Belle's hands in both of hers. "I've heard what you did that night," she said kindly. "You're very welcome here." Inside, the house felt even larger. High ceilings. Marble floors. Chandeliers casting soft light. Fresh flowers on tables. The quiet scent of polished wood and something warm and clean. Margaret led Belle upstairs. They stopped at a room painted in soft pink. "This is Rosalie's room." Inside was a white crib, toys neatly arranged, a rocking chair by the window. Then Margaret opened the door beside it. "And this is yours." Belle stepped inside and froze. The room was 3 times the size of her old apartment. A king-sized bed with crisp white sheets. Thick curtains. A private bathroom. A window overlooking the garden. For a long moment, she just stood there. She didn't know where to put her hands. Didn't know where she belonged in a place like this. A soft sound pulled her back. Rosalie was looking up at her, smiling. Not a big smile. Just a quiet, trusting one. And suddenly, the room didn't feel so overwhelming. It felt warm. The first week passed slowly. Silas stayed home most of the time, showing Belle every detail of Rosalie's routine. "She likes her milk warm," he said one afternoon. "Not hot. Just warm. She sleeps best between 1 and 3. She likes to be carried outside in the afternoon. She watches the trees." He spoke carefully, like a father who had memorized every small thing about his child. Belle listened, surprised by how natural it all began to feel. The 2 years of nursing school she thought she had forgotten started coming back to her. She knew how to check temperature, how to recognize when the baby was uncomfortable, how to soothe her when she cried. And Rosalie seemed to remember her. If Belle left the room, the baby fussed. When she returned, Rosalie's whole face lit up. Margaret watched them one morning and smiled. "She trusts you already," she said softly. But not everything in the house felt warm. The first night, Belle woke up to Rosalie stirring and went to settle her. On her way back to her room, she heard voices downstairs. Silas's voice. Cold. Sharp. Nothing like the gentle tone he used with his daughter. She couldn't hear the words clearly. Just the edge in his voice. The sound of someone giving orders. The next day, men in dark suits came and went through a heavy door on the first floor. The door always stayed closed. Barrett appeared everywhere. A radio at his ear. Eyes always moving. Security cameras weren't just at the gate. They were along the walls. In the garden. On the roof. One night, while warming a bottle in the kitchen, Belle passed that closed office door. Silas's voice came through the crack. No negotiation. The North Territory is ours. Belle stopped walking. Just for a second. Then she kept going. She didn't ask questions. She didn't need to. This house held two worlds. Upstairs, there was a baby's laughter, soft blankets, and warm milk. Downstairs, there were quiet meetings, guarded doors, and a life built on power. And Belle was standing right between them. A few days later, in the late afternoon, she carried Rosalie into the backyard. The winter sun was pale but gentle. Rosalie babbled happily, reaching for the light on the snow. Belle smiled and kissed her cheek. That was when she heard an engine near the gate. Not one of the usual cars. Two men stepped out of a black sedan outside the fence. Barrett's voice cracked through his radio. Code red. Get them inside. Now. A guard appeared beside Belle instantly. Inside, ma'am. His hand was firm but careful on her back. Belle clutched Rosalie and hurried toward the house, her heart suddenly pounding. The door shut behind them. Margaret was already there. Upstairs, she said quietly. Lock the nursery. Belle ran. Rosalie began to cry, sensing the fear in her arms. It's okay, Belle whispered, even though she wasn't sure it was. From the window upstairs, she watched Barrett and the guards at the gate. No shouting. No weapons. But the way the two men finally turned and drove away told her everything. They hadn't left because they wanted to. They had left because they were told to. 30 minutes later, she heard a car pull into the driveway. Fast. Heavy. Footsteps moved quickly through the house. Then there was a knock on the nursery door. Belle opened it. Silas stood there, his face calm. Too calm. Everything's handled, he said. But when his eyes moved from Belle to Rosalie and back again, she saw something else there. Fear. Not for himself. For them. And for the first time since she arrived, Belle understood something clearly. She hadn't just stepped into a rich man's home. She had stepped into a world where someone might be watching her, and waiting for the moment she mattered too much. For a moment, no one spoke. Rosalie was still in Belle's arms, her small face pressed against Belle's shoulder, her breathing slowly calming after the rush upstairs. Silas stood in the doorway, his eyes moving between them, checking, making sure they were both safe. Just a business misunderstanding, he said finally. His voice was steady. But Belle had already learned something about him. When Silas Thornton spoke quietly, that was when things were serious. Belle nodded, even though she didn't fully understand what kind of business brought strangers to a gate guarded like a fortress. She didn't ask questions. Because the truth was, she wasn't sure she wanted the answers. That night, after Rosalie fell asleep, there was a soft knock on Belle's door. When she opened it, Silas stood there, his hands in his pockets, his expression tired. "Can we talk?" he asked. Belle stepped aside. He didn't sit right away. Instead, he walked to the window and looked out at the garden where the security lights cut long shadows across the snow. "The men today," he said after a moment. "They weren't random." Belle waited. "There's another family," he continued. They control the south side of the city. We've had an understanding for years. I don't cross into their territory. They don't cross into mine. His jaw tightened slightly. But when I was at the hospital, when my attention was somewhere else, they tested the line. Belle felt a cold feeling move slowly through her chest. What does that mean? She asked quietly. Silas turned toward her. It means they were reminding me that I have something to lose. The room fell silent. Belle understood the words. But what she didn't expect was what he said next. They took a picture, Silas continued, from outside the fence. Of you. And Rosalie. The air left Belle's lungs. He pulled his phone from his pocket and showed her the image. It was taken from far away, slightly blurred. But it was clear enough. Belle standing in the yard, holding Rosalie in the winter sunlight. Someone had been watching. Her hands tightened around the edge of the chair. Does that mean, she hesitated, her voice barely steady, that I'm in danger? Silas didn't answer immediately. And that silence said more than any words. I won't let anything happen to you, he said finally. Each word slow, firm. Security has already been increased. No one comes near this house without clearance. Belle nodded. But inside, something shifted. She had grown up poor. She knew what danger looked like. Empty streets at night. Arguments through thin apartment walls. Walking home with her keys between her fingers. But this was different. This was danger that came quietly. From a distance. From people who didn't need to shout. Silas watched her for a long moment. Then he said something she didn't expect. If you want to leave, I'll understand. Belle looked up sharply. I'll make sure you're taken care of, he continued. Money. A safe place. A new job somewhere else. Whatever you need. His voice wasn't commanding now. It was careful. Almost afraid. Because he wasn't talking to an employee. He was talking to the woman who held his daughter every night. Belle didn't answer right away. Instead, her eyes drifted toward the connecting door to the nursery. Rosalie was sleeping on the other side of that wall, wrapped in a soft blanket, breathing slowly, trusting the world was safe. Belle thought about the night in the storm, about the way that tiny hand had grabbed her uniform, about the warmth of her small body against her chest. Then she looked back at Silas. I'm not leaving, she said. Her voice was quiet, but it didn't shake. Silas searched her face, as if making sure she meant it. You don't have to stay out of loyalty, he said. I'm not staying for you, Belle replied gently. She hesitated, then added, I'm staying for her. Something in his expression softened. For the first time, the tension in his shoulders eased. Thank you, he said quietly. After he left, Belle sat alone in her room for a long time. The house was quiet, but she could hear the distant sound of footsteps outside, guards moving through their patrol. Her world had changed. Not just because she was living in a mansion, but because she was no longer invisible. Someone out there knew her face, knew she mattered. The next few days passed with subtle changes. More cameras appeared along the western fence. 2 additional guards stood near the garden entrance. Whenever Belle took Rosalie outside, someone stayed within sight. At first, the attention made her uneasy. But something strange happened. The fear didn't grow. It settled. Because every time she held Rosalie, every time the baby smiled at her, the world outside the fence felt less important. One afternoon, while Belle was sitting on the floor of the nursery, helping Rosalie practice standing, Margaret appeared in the doorway. She's attached to you, Margaret said softly. Rosalie was gripping Belle's fingers, wobbling on unsteady legs, laughing at her own effort. Belle smiled. I think I'm more attached to her, she admitted. Margaret watched them for a moment. You've changed this house, she said quietly. Belle looked up, surprised. Mr. Thornton comes home earlier now, Margaret continued. He eats in the kitchen instead of the office. He smiles more. Belle didn't know what to say. She hadn't noticed. Or maybe she had, and hadn't allowed herself to think about it. That evening, Silas came upstairs to say good night. He stood beside the crib as Belle adjusted the blanket around Rosalie. For a moment, their hands brushed. It was a small thing. Accidental. But neither of them pulled away immediately. The silence between them felt different now. Not awkward. Not distant. Just aware. Thank you for staying, he said quietly. Belle nodded. She didn't trust herself to say more. Because the truth was something she wasn't ready to face yet. This place no longer felt like a job. It was starting to feel like something else. Something warmer. Something dangerous in a different way. Later that night, Belle woke to a faint sound. Not Rosalie. Voices. She stepped into the hallway and looked down toward the first floor. The office door was open. Light spilled into the hallway. Inside, she could see Silas standing near his desk, his voice low but sharp. No negotiations. The territory stays as it is. There was a pause. Then he added quietly, "And if they come near my house again, it won't end peacefully." Belle stood there for a moment, unseen in the shadows. Then she turned and went back to the nursery. Rosalie stirred as Belle lifted her gently. The baby settled against her chest almost immediately, her breathing slowing. Belle rocked her slowly in the dim light. Outside the window, security lights moved across the garden. Inside, a baby slept peacefully in her arms. And as Belle pressed her cheek against Rosalie's soft hair, one thought settled quietly in her heart. She wasn't afraid of the danger outside anymore. She was afraid of something else. She was afraid that one day, she might not be able to leave this world at all. For a moment, no one spoke. Rosalie was still in Belle's arms, her small face pressed against Belle's shoulder, her breathing slowly calming after the rush upstairs. Silas stood in the doorway, his eyes moving between them, checking, making sure they were both safe. "Just a business misunderstanding," he said finally. His voice was steady. But Belle had already learned something about him. When Silas Thornton spoke quietly, that was when things were serious. Belle nodded, even though she didn't fully understand what kind of business brought strangers to a gate guarded like a fortress. She didn't ask questions. Because the truth was, she wasn't sure she wanted the answers. That night, after Rosalie fell asleep, there was a soft knock on Belle's door. When she opened it, Silas stood there, his hands in his pockets, his expression tired. "Can we talk?" he asked. Belle stepped aside. He didn't sit right away. Instead, he walked to the window and looked out at the garden where the security lights cut long shadows across the snow. "The men today," he said after a moment. "They weren't random." Belle waited. "There's another family," he continued. "They control the south side of the city. We've had an understanding for years. I don't cross into their territory. They don't cross into mine." His jaw tightened slightly. "But when I was at the hospital, when my attention was somewhere else, they tested the line." Belle felt a cold feeling move slowly through her chest. "What does that mean?" she asked quietly. Silas turned toward her. "It means they were reminding me that I have something to lose." The room fell silent. Belle understood the words. But what she didn't expect was what he said next. "They took a picture," Silas continued, "from outside the fence. Of you. And Rosalie." The air left Belle's lungs. He pulled his phone from his pocket and showed her the image. It was taken from far away, slightly blurred. But it was clear enough. Belle standing in the yard, holding Rosalie in the winter sunlight. Someone had been watching. Her hands tightened around the edge of the chair. "Does that mean," she hesitated, her voice barely steady, "that I'm in danger?" Silas didn't answer immediately, and that silence said more than any words. "I won't let anything happen to you," he said finally. Each word slow, firm. "Security has already been increased. No one comes near this house without clearance." Belle nodded. But inside, something shifted. She had grown up poor. She knew what danger looked like. Empty streets at night. Arguments through thin apartment walls. Walking home with her keys between her fingers. But this was different. This was danger that came quietly. From a distance. From people who didn't need to shout. Silas watched her for a long moment. Then he said something she didn't expect. "If you want to leave, I'll understand." Belle looked up sharply. "I'll make sure you're taken care of," he continued. "Money. A safe place. A new job somewhere else. Whatever you need." His voice wasn't commanding now. It was careful. Almost afraid. Because he wasn't talking to an employee. He was talking to the woman who held his daughter every night. Belle didn't answer right away. Instead, her eyes drifted toward the connecting door to the nursery. Rosalie was sleeping on the other side of that wall, wrapped in a soft blanket, breathing slowly, trusting the world was safe. Belle thought about the night in the storm, about the way that tiny hand had grabbed her uniform, about the warmth of her small body against her chest. Then she looked back at Silas. "I'm not leaving," she said. Her voice was quiet, but it didn't shake. Silas searched her face, as if making sure she meant it. "You don't have to stay out of loyalty," he said. "I'm not staying for you," Belle replied gently. She hesitated, then added, "I'm staying for her." Something in his expression softened. For the first time, the tension in his shoulders eased. "Thank you," he said quietly. After he left, Belle sat alone in her room for a long time. The house was quiet, but she could hear the distant sound of footsteps outside, guards moving through their patrol. Her world had changed, not just because she was living in a mansion, but because she was no longer invisible. Someone out there knew her face, knew she mattered. The next few days passed with subtle changes. More cameras appeared along the western fence. 2 additional guards stood near the garden entrance. Whenever Belle took Rosalie outside, someone stayed within sight. At first, the attention made her uneasy. But something strange happened. The fear didn't grow. It settled. Because every time she held Rosalie, every time the baby smiled at her, the world outside the fence felt less important. One afternoon, while Belle was sitting on the floor of the nursery, helping Rosalie practice standing, Margaret appeared in the doorway. "She's attached to you," Margaret said softly. Rosalie was gripping Belle's fingers, wobbling on unsteady legs, laughing at her own effort. Belle smiled. "I think I'm more attached to her," she admitted. Margaret watched them for a moment. "You've changed this house," she said quietly. Belle looked up, surprised. "Mr. Thornton comes home earlier now," Margaret continued. "He eats in the kitchen instead of the office. He smiles more." Belle didn't know what to say. She hadn't noticed. Or maybe she had, and hadn't allowed herself to think about it. That evening, Silas came upstairs to say good night. He stood beside the crib as Belle adjusted the blanket around Rosalie. For a moment, their hands brushed. It was a small thing. Accidental. But neither of them pulled away immediately. The silence between them felt different now. Not awkward. Not distant. Just aware. "Thank you for staying," he said quietly. Belle nodded. She didn't trust herself to say more. Because the truth was something she wasn't ready to face yet. This place no longer felt like a job. It was starting to feel like something else. Something warmer. Something dangerous in a different way. Later that night, Belle woke to a faint sound. Not Rosalie. Voices. She stepped into the hallway and looked down toward the first floor. The office door was open. Light spilled into the hallway. Inside, she could see Silas standing near his desk, his voice low but sharp. No negotiations. The territory stays as it is. There was a pause. Then he added quietly, "And if they come near my house again, it won't end peacefully." Belle stood there for a moment, unseen in the shadows. Then she turned and went back to the nursery. Rosalie stirred as Belle lifted her gently. The baby settled against her chest almost immediately, her breathing slowing. Belle rocked her slowly in the dim light. Outside the window, security lights moved across the garden. Inside, a baby slept peacefully in her arms. And as Belle pressed her cheek against Rosalie's soft hair, one thought settled quietly in her heart. She wasn't afraid of the danger outside anymore. She was afraid of something else. She was afraid that one day, she might not be able to leave this world at all. The feeling didn't leave her. Even the next morning, while sunlight poured softly through the nursery curtains and Rosalie sat on the floor banging a wooden toy against the carpet, Belle found herself quieter than usual. Because something had shifted inside her. It wasn't fear of the guards. It wasn't fear of the men outside the gates. It was the realization that this house was beginning to feel like home. And that thought scared her more than anything else. "Up you go," she whispered, helping Rosalie stand. The baby grabbed Belle's fingers, her legs wobbling, her face bright with determination. When she managed 2 tiny steps before dropping back onto the carpet, she burst into laughter. Belle laughed too. Moments like this made everything else fade away. The power, the danger, the distance between rich and poor. In those moments, there was only a child learning how to stand, and someone who didn't want to let her fall. Later that afternoon, Belle carried Rosalie downstairs. Silas was in the kitchen, something Belle had begun to notice more often. In the early days, Margaret had told her he rarely came home before midnight. Now he was there most evenings, sleeves rolled up, coffee forgotten on the counter while he answered emails or reviewed documents. But the moment he saw Rosalie, the phone went down. "Hey there, little one," he said softly. Rosalie reached for him immediately. He took her, lifting her easily, and something about the way his expression changed never failed to surprise Belle. The hard lines disappeared. The controlled, careful businessman was gone. In his place was just a father. "She tried walking today," Belle said. Silas looked at Rosalie, his eyes widening slightly. "Did you now?" he murmured. The baby grabbed his collar, babbling proudly. He laughed quietly, pressing his forehead against hers. For a second, Belle looked away. Because there was something almost too intimate about watching it. Something that made her feel like she was standing inside a family moment she didn't technically belong to. "Stay for dinner," Silas said suddenly. Belle blinked. "I usually eat upstairs," she replied. "I know," he said. "But you don't have to." There was no pressure in his voice. Just a simple invitation. That night, they ate in the kitchen instead of the formal dining room. Margaret brought the food, then quietly disappeared, leaving the 3 of them alone. Rosalie sat between them in her high chair, smearing mashed vegetables across her tray and occasionally onto her face. At one point, she grabbed a handful and reached toward Silas. He didn't move fast enough. The green smear landed across his sleeve. For a second, Belle froze. She expected frustration. Or at least annoyance. Instead, Silas just looked at the mess, then at his daughter. And laughed. A real laugh. "Guess that's my fault," he said. Belle couldn't help smiling. Something about that moment made the kitchen feel smaller, warmer, normal. After dinner, Belle went upstairs to settle Rosalie for the night. The routine had become familiar. Warm bath, soft pajamas, the star-shaped nightlight glowing gently against the ceiling. As Belle rocked her slowly, humming under her breath, Rosalie's small hand rested against her collarbone. Her breathing slowed. Her body relaxed. Just before she drifted off, her fingers tightened slightly, like she didn't want to let go. Belle swallowed. Because that small instinctive grip did something to her heart every single time. When she finally laid Rosalie in the crib and stepped into the hallway, she found Silas standing there. He must have been listening. "She sleeps easier when you sing," he said quietly. Belle shrugged a little. "My mother used to sing to me like that," she admitted. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The hallway light was soft, the house unusually quiet. Then Silas said, almost carefully, "I didn't grow up like this." Belle looked at him. "My father built everything," he continued. "But there wasn't much warmth in the house. Everything was business. Everything was control." He glanced toward the nursery. "I didn't want that for her." But when Camille, he stopped himself. The name hung between them. Belle had never asked about Rosalie's mother. She knew only that she was gone. Silas took a slow breath. "She disappeared 3 days before you found Rosalie," he said. Belle's chest tightened. "She left a note," he continued quietly. "Said she couldn't do it any more." The same words. The same ones pinned to the blanket that night. "I thought I understood pressure," Silas went on. "But I didn't understand what she was going through." There was no anger in his voice. Only regret. For a moment, Belle didn't know what to say. Then she spoke gently. "Sometimes people don't leave because they don't care," she said. "Sometimes they leave because they think they're the problem." Silas looked at her. Really looked at her. And for the first time, Belle realized something. He wasn't just listening to her because she took care of his daughter. He trusted her. That realization made the air between them feel heavier. After a long silence, he said quietly, "She's in a hospital now." Belle's eyes widened slightly. Doctors found her in New York. She'd been staying in a cheap motel. No credit cards. No phone. His jaw tightened. "They're saying it might be postpartum depression. Severe." Belle felt a slow ache settle in her chest. Because she remembered those words from nursing school. And she remembered how dangerous that kind of silence could be. "Has she asked about Rosalie?" Belle asked. Silas shook his head. "No." The hallway grew quiet again. Then he added, almost like a confession, "I don't know if she ever will." That night, long after the lights were off, Belle sat beside Rosalie's crib longer than usual. The baby slept peacefully. Safe. Warm. But somewhere out there was a woman who had carried her for 9 months, and then walked away. Belle didn't judge her. Because she knew something most people didn't. Pain didn't care if you were rich or poor. Loneliness didn't care how big your house was. And sometimes the strongest people broke the quietest. The next afternoon, while cleaning the nursery shelves, Belle moved a small cabinet away from the wall. Something fell behind it. A small brown notebook, worn at the edges. A faint coffee stain across the cover. Belle picked it up slowly. She opened the first page. The handwriting was neat at the beginning. Dated entries. Thoughts about pregnancy. About decorating the nursery. About loving Silas. Belle turned the page. The writing grew shakier. Shorter. Darker. Her breath caught as she read one line. "I hold my baby, and I feel nothing. I think something inside me is broken. Belle sat down slowly in the rocking chair. Her hands were trembling, because she knew what this was. She turned another page, then another. The words became heavier, lonelier. I hear a voice telling me she would be better without me. Belle's eyes filled with tears. The final entry was only one sentence, written 3 days before the blizzard night. Forgive me. Belle closed the diary slowly, pressing it against her chest. And in that quiet nursery, with Rosalie sleeping just a few feet away, she realized something that made her heart sink. The woman who left that baby in the storm hadn't abandoned her out of cruelty. She had left her out of despair. And now Belle was holding a truth that could change everything. The only question was whether she should tell Silas what she had just discovered.